Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're diving into some absolutely unhinged stories from the internet that will have you questioning whether these situations are even real. Because honestly, the things people share online sometimes feel like they're straight out of a movie script. But that's what makes them so fascinating, isn't it? The fact that these wild experiences happen to ordinary people just going about their lives until everything falls apart. Before we get started, I just want to say thank you for being here. Whether you're watching this to fall asleep, to unwind after a long day, or just because you enjoy these stories as much as I do, your support means everything. So grab your favourite drink, get comfortable, maybe pull up some Minecraft in the background, and let's explore some stories together that might just make you grateful for the people in your own life. Our first story tonight comes from someone who discovered that the person they loved most had been lying about absolutely everything, and I mean everything. So this all started about 3 years ago. I was 28 at the time, working as a software developer for a mid-sized tech company. I had been dating my girlfriend Sarah for almost 2 years. We met at a friend's birthday party, hit it off immediately, and within 6 months we had moved in together. Everything seemed perfect. She was kind, funny, always supportive of my career ambitions. We talked about marriage, about having kids someday, about buying a house in the suburbs. Normal couple stuff, you know? Sarah worked as a marketing consultant, or at least that's what she told me. She would leave for work every morning around 8, come home around 6, and sometimes had to travel for client meetings. Nothing seemed unusual about any of this. Her schedule made sense for the kind of work she described. The first crack in the foundation appeared about 18 months into our relationship. I had come down with a nasty flu and had to take a few days off work. Sarah still went to her job, obviously, but on the second day of being sick, I realized I had completely run out of cold medicine. I felt miserable but decided to venture out to the pharmacy down the street. While I was there, I ran into one of Sarah's college friends, a woman named Rachel, who I had met maybe twice before at social gatherings. Rachel seemed surprised to see me and asked how I was doing. We made small talk for a minute before she casually mentioned how nice it was that Sarah had taken time off to take care of me. I was confused and told her that Sarah was at work. Rachel's face did this thing where you could tell she immediately regretted saying something. She quickly changed the subject, said she had to run, and practically bolted out of the pharmacy. I stood there for a while, holding a bottle of NyQuil, trying to make sense of what just happened. Maybe Rachel was confused. Maybe she was thinking of someone else. Maybe Sarah had mentioned she was taking time off and then changed her mind. There were 100 explanations that made more sense than what my gut was telling me. I went home, took my medicine, and tried to sleep it off. When Sarah came home that evening, I casually asked how her day was. She talked about a difficult client meeting, about traffic on the way home, about how she hoped I was feeling better. She seemed completely normal. So I convinced myself that Rachel must have been mistaken, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing little things. Sarah would sometimes pause for just a split second too long before answering questions about her day. Her stories about work colleagues never included specific names after the first few months of dating. She was oddly protective of her phone, always keeping it face down and taking it with her even when she went to the bathroom. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was being the kind of suspicious partner I had always sworn I would never be. Sarah had never given me any real reason to distrust her, so I pushed these thoughts aside and focused on our relationship, which from all outward appearances was still going strong. The second incident happened about 8 months later. We were at a restaurant celebrating our 2-year anniversary when the waitress recognized Sarah. She came over to our table all excited, saying she hadn't seen her since high school and asking how she had been. Sarah's face went pale. She stammered something about having the wrong person, and when the waitress mentioned Sarah's name, Sarah insisted she must be thinking of someone else with a similar face. The waitress looked embarrassed and apologized, saying she could have sworn Sarah was a girl she went to high school with. After she walked away, I asked Sarah what that was about. She laughed it off, saying she just had one of those faces, and quickly changed the subject to what we should order for dessert. But here's the thing. The waitress had called her by her correct name, Sarah, not some other name that she might have confused. And Sarah's reaction was weird. Not annoyed or amused, but genuinely panicked, even if only for a moment. That night, after Sarah fell asleep, I did something I'm not proud of. I went through her wallet. I found her driver's license, which showed the name and photo I expected. But tucked behind it was another ID with a different name entirely. Same photo, different name, different address. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there next to her, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to wake her up and demand answers. Part of me was terrified of what those answers might be. And a small, desperate part of me was still trying to come up with innocent explanations. Maybe it was an old ID from before she legally changed her name. Maybe she was in witness protection. Maybe there was some perfectly reasonable explanation that would make all of this make sense. The next day, while Sarah was at work, I started digging. I called the company where she supposedly worked. They had no record of anyone by her name ever being employed there. I looked up her social media history, really looked, and realized that her accounts only went back about 3 years, right before we met. No old photos, no posts about high school or college friends, nothing that suggested a life before the one I knew her in. I felt sick. 2 years. We had been together for 2 years. We had talked about marriage, about children, about growing old together, and I didn't even know who she really was. I hired a private investigator. I know that sounds dramatic, but I didn't know what else to do. I gave him both names, the one she had given me and the one on the second ID, along with everything else I knew about her. He said he would look into it and get back to me within a week. Those 7 days were the longest of my life. I went through the motions of our normal routine, having dinner together, watching shows, talking about our days, but the whole time I felt like I was performing in a play, saying lines I had memorized without really meaning any of them. Sarah seemed to notice something was off and kept asking if I was okay. I blamed it on work stress, and she accepted that explanation without question. The investigator called me exactly 1 week later. What he told me completely shattered my understanding of reality. Sarah wasn't her real name. It wasn't even close. Her real name was Jennifer, and she had quite a history. She had been married twice before, both times under different names. Her first husband had divorced her after discovering she had lied about her entire background, including her job, her education, and her family history. Her second husband had actually pressed charges when he discovered she had been slowly draining money from his accounts. But it got worse. The PI found records suggesting that Jennifer, or Sarah, or whatever her real name was, had been doing this for over a decade. She would reinvent herself, target men who seemed financially stable, build relationships with them, and then either disappear with whatever money she could get, or stick around until she got caught. It was almost like a career for her. A sick, twisted career built on manipulation and lies. I spent the next few days in a daze, trying to process everything. I went back through our finances with a fine-tooth comb and discovered that she had indeed been siphoning money from our joint account into an account I didn't know existed. Nothing huge, just a few $100s here and there, but it added up to almost $10,000 over 2 years. Finally, I confronted her. I came home from work one evening, and she was on the couch watching television like nothing was wrong. I sat down across from her and said her real name, Jennifer. Her face went through about 15 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds. Confusion, recognition, fear, anger, and finally, a strange sort of calm acceptance. She didn't deny anything. She didn't even try to explain. She just looked at me and asked how I found out. I told her about the second ID, about the PI, about everything. She listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally like I was telling her a mildly interesting story rather than confronting her about destroying my life. When I was done, she stood up, went to our bedroom, and started packing a bag. No apology, no explanation, no tears. She just packed her things like she was going on a business trip. Before she walked out the door, she turned to me and said something I will never forget. She said that I should have been smarter, that she had given me plenty of chances to figure it out, and that it was my own fault for not paying attention. Then she left, just like that. 2 years of my life, gone in the span of one evening. I never saw her again. I filed a police report, but since the amount of money she had taken was relatively small and I had technically given her access to the account, there wasn't much they could do. The PI told me she had probably already reinvented herself somewhere else, starting the whole cycle over again with some other unsuspecting guy. It took me a long time to recover from that, not just financially, but emotionally. Learning to trust anyone again felt impossible for a while. I went to therapy, talked about what happened, worked through the shame and anger and confusion. Eventually, I started dating again, very cautiously, with a lot more skepticism than I had before. I'm sharing this story because I want people to understand that these things don't just happen in movies. Con artists exist, people who can lie with complete conviction, who can build entire fake identities and maintain them for years. They're out there. And they target normal people, people like me, who are just looking for love and companionship and don't expect the person sleeping next to them to be a complete fabrication. If something feels off in your relationship, trust that feeling. Don't ignore it like I did for months. Don't convince yourself that you're being paranoid, because maybe you are. But maybe you're not. And it's better to find out the truth early than to spend years of your life loving someone who doesn't actually exist. That story hits hard, doesn't it? The idea that someone could maintain such an elaborate deception for years is genuinely terrifying. But unfortunately, it happens more often than most people realize. Let's move on to our next story, which involves a different kind of lie, but one that was equally devastating. This one comes from a woman who discovered that her husband of 15 years had been hiding a secret that changed everything she thought she knew about their marriage. So my name is Maria, and I'm 42 years old now. When this story takes place, I was 39, married to my husband David for 15 years, with 2 beautiful children, a 13-year-old son named Lucas, and a 10-year-old daughter named Emma. We had built what I thought was a wonderful life together. We had a nice house in the suburbs, good jobs, supportive families, the whole picture-perfect setup. David was, or so I thought, the ideal husband. He was devoted, hard-working, always prioritized family time despite his demanding job as a financial advisor. He coached Lucas's soccer team, attended every one of Emma's dance recitals, and never missed date nights with me. Our friends always commented on how lucky we were to have found each other, how obvious it was that we were soulmates. The day everything changed started like any other Saturday. David had gone to what he said was a work conference for the weekend, something that happened maybe 3 or 4 times a year. The kids and I had plans to go to the movies and then grab pizza for dinner, normal family stuff. But then I got a phone call from David's sister, Rachel. She sounded confused and asked me why David was at her house. I told her that was impossible because David was at a conference in Denver. There was a long pause before Rachel said that David was definitely not in Denver because she was looking at him right now, sitting at her kitchen table with a woman she had never seen before. My heart stopped. I asked Rachel to repeat what she had just said, and she did, sounding increasingly uncomfortable. David was at her house, with another woman, in what appeared to be a very intimate setting. Rachel had stopped by unannounced to drop off some things she had borrowed, and there they were. I don't remember much of the next hour. I know I got in my car. I know I drove to Rachel's house, which was about 45 minutes away. I know I called my mother to come watch the kids. But the details are hazy, obscured by the shock and the anger and the heartbreak that were all fighting for space in my chest. When I arrived at Rachel's house, David's car was still in the driveway. I walked up to the front door, which Rachel had left unlocked for me, and stepped inside. And there was my husband, sitting at the kitchen table with a woman I had never seen before, looking at me like I was the ghost of Christmas past. The woman was beautiful, I noticed through my haze of emotions. Younger than me, maybe early 30s, with long dark hair and an expression of pure horror on her face. David jumped up from his chair and started saying my name, but I couldn't hear him. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. Rachel was standing by the counter, looking like she wished she was anywhere else on the planet. She later told me that when she had arrived and seen them, she had immediately called me, and David had spent the entire 45 minutes trying to convince her not to say anything. He had actually suggested that Rachel lie to me about what she had seen. The woman, whose name I learned was Lisa, was the first one to speak coherently. She looked at me and asked if I was his wife. His wife? That's how she phrased it, like she wasn't sure. I nodded, unable to form words. She turned to David and asked him what was going on, and it became very clear very quickly that this woman had no idea David was married. What unfolded over the next few hours was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. Lisa had been dating David for almost 2 years. 2 years. She knew him by a different name, knew nothing about me or our children, and thought she was in an exclusive, committed relationship with a single man who worked in real estate. He had told her he travelled a lot for work, which explained why he could only see her on weekends and occasionally during the week. David had been living a complete double life. The work conferences, time with Lisa. The late nights at the office, time with Lisa. The occasional business dinners, you guessed it, all Lisa. I felt like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. This couldn't be happening to me. Not to us. Not after 15 years and 2 children and a life we had built together. But it was happening, and there was no denying it. The worst part, and I know this sounds strange to say given everything else, was watching Lisa's heart break in real time. She had been lied to just as much as I had. She had fallen in love with a man who didn't exist, just like I had been loving a version of David that was apparently a complete fiction. By the end of that afternoon, Lisa and I were actually comforting each other, 2 women united by the betrayal of the same man. David tried to explain. He said he had never meant for it to go this far, that his relationship with Lisa had started as a meaningless fling that somehow spiraled into something more. That he still loved me, that he had always loved me, that Lisa was just something else, something separate from our real life together, as if having an entire secret girlfriend for 2 years was somehow less serious than what I was making it out to be. I filed for divorce the following week. I know some people would have tried to work it out, would have gone to couples therapy and tried to save the marriage for the sake of the kids, but I couldn't. The betrayal was too deep, the lies too extensive. I didn't even know who my husband was anymore. The man I thought I had married, the devoted father and loving husband, had been capable of deceiving me completely for years. How could I ever trust anything he said again? The divorce was messy. David fought for joint custody, claiming that despite his betrayal of me, he was still a good father. And maybe he was, I don't know anymore. But the kids were devastated by the whole thing. Lucas, especially, took it hard. He had idolized his father, wanted to be just like him when he grew up. Learning the truth about who his father really was shattered something inside him. It's been 3 years now since that Saturday afternoon at Rachel's house. I'm still rebuilding my life, still learning to trust again, still dealing with the aftermath of a 15-year marriage that turned out to be built on lies. Lisa and I actually stayed in touch for a while. We had a strange sort of bond, both of us having been fooled by the same man. She eventually moved across the country for a fresh start, but we still message sometimes. David remarried last year. Some woman he met after the divorce, which tells me he probably hasn't changed at all. I feel sorry for her, honestly. She probably has no idea what she's gotten herself into. The reason I'm sharing this story is to remind people that you never really know someone. 15 years, 2 children, a life built together, and the whole time my husband was capable of maintaining an entirely separate relationship without any of us knowing. If that can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. Trust your instincts. Pay attention to the inconsistencies. And don't be afraid to ask questions, even if you're scared of the answers, because the truth will come out eventually. It always does. And it's better to know sooner rather than later. Those stories are heavy, I know. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about a different kind of betrayal, the kind that comes from family rather than romantic partners. This next story comes from someone who discovered that the parents who raised them had been lying about something fundamental for their entire life. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, the youngest of 3 children. My parents, Carol and Robert, were respected members of the community. My father worked for the local government, and my mother was an elementary school teacher. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable, and my childhood was generally happy. I always knew I was a little different from my siblings. They both had my father's dark hair and my mother's green eyes. I had blonde hair and blue eyes. which my parents explained away by pointing to some distant relatives on my mother's side. I never questioned it. Why would I? They were my parents, and I trusted them completely. The first hint that something wasn't quite right came when I was 16. We had a family tree project in biology class, and one component involved creating Punnett squares to trace inherited traits. When I sat down to do the assignment, something didn't add up. Based on what I knew about my parents' genetics, it was basically impossible for them to have a child with my colouring. I brought this up to my biology teacher, Mrs. Henderson, who looked uncomfortable and suggested that genetics can be more complicated than the simple models we learn in high school. She was probably right. I didn't think much more about it. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Over the years, I noticed other things. My medical history didn't quite match up with my family's. My siblings had inherited my father's tendency toward high blood pressure and my mother's seasonal allergies. I had neither of these things. I was also slightly built, while everyone else in my family was tall and broad-shouldered. Again, individual variation can explain a lot, but it started to feel like more than coincidence. I finally learned the truth when I was 24 years old, after my father passed away from a heart attack. I was helping my mother go through his things when I found a folder tucked away in the back of his closet. Inside were documents I had never seen before, including my birth certificate, which listed my parents' names as expected, along with another document showing that I had been adopted. I was adopted. My parents, who I had trusted completely for my entire life, had kept this secret from me. My siblings knew, I learned later. Everyone in the family knew except me. They had decided when I was an infant that they would never tell me, that I would grow up believing I was biologically theirs and that the secret would go with them to their graves. My mother's face when I confronted her is something I will never forget. She looked terrified, like a child who had been caught doing something wrong. She tried to explain that they had done it out of love, that they didn't want me to feel different from my siblings, that they had always considered me their real child in every way that mattered. But that wasn't the point. The point was that they had lied to me, for 24 years, about something as fundamental as who I was and where I came from. Every time I had asked about family medical history, they had lied. Every time I had wondered why I looked different, they had deflected. Every time I had trusted them with something important, they had already been keeping the biggest secret of my life. The adoption itself wasn't the problem. I could have accepted that. Adopted children are just as much a part of their families as biological children. What I couldn't accept was the deception, the systematic, decades-long effort to keep me in the dark about my own identity. I tried to find my biological parents. It took about 2 years, but I eventually located my birth mother through a DNA testing service. Her name was Susan, and she had been 17 when she had me. She wasn't in a position to raise a child, and she had made what she described as the hardest decision of her life in giving me up for adoption. She had always hoped I would find her someday. Meeting Susan was one of the most emotional experiences of my life. Looking at her was like looking in a mirror, 25 years older. We had the same eyes, the same smile, the same nervous habit of playing with our hair when we were uncomfortable. She told me about my biological father, a young man she had dated briefly who had wanted nothing to do with the pregnancy. She told me about her family, my biological grandparents, who had passed away but who had talked about me often, wondering how I was doing. I now have relationships with both my adoptive family and my biological family. It's complicated, and sometimes it's hard, but it's real. The hardest part has been rebuilding trust with my adoptive mother and siblings. They all knew about the lie and participated in keeping it. That's not something you just get over overnight. My relationship with my adoptive mother is still strained. I've tried to forgive her, and in many ways I have, but the trust we had before can never be fully restored. She still maintains that she did the right thing, that keeping the secret was what was best for me. I've stopped trying to convince her otherwise. Some battles aren't worth fighting. The lesson I took from this experience is that lies, even well-intentioned ones, have consequences. My parents thought they were protecting me, but what they actually did was build our entire relationship on a foundation of deception. And when that deception was finally revealed, it called everything else into question. If they could lie about this, what else could they lie about? I share this story because I know there are other adoptive families out there struggling with the same decision. To them I would say, please tell your children the truth. They deserve to know who they are and where they come from. They can handle it, I promise. What they can't handle, what no one can handle, is discovering that the people they trusted most in the world have been lying to them their entire lives. These family secrets can cut so deep. The betrayal feels different when it comes from the people who were supposed to protect you, doesn't it? Let's continue with another story that explores this dynamic. This one comes from a woman who discovered something shocking about her perfect marriage and the in-laws she thought she knew. I had been married to my husband, James, for 8 years when I found out the truth about his family. We had met in college, dated for 3 years before getting engaged, and had what I thought was a completely normal courtship and marriage. James came from what seemed like a wonderful family. His parents, Martha and Richard, were warm and welcoming from the moment they met me. They treated me like a daughter, invited me to all family events, and always made me feel included. James had one sibling, an older brother named Thomas, who lived across the country with his wife and children. I had only met Thomas a handful of times over the years, mostly at holidays and family reunions. He seemed nice enough, though we never developed a close relationship given the distance. The truth came out during a family gathering at Martha and Richard's house. It was Thanksgiving, and for once, everyone was there. Thomas and his family had flown in, and we were all together under one roof. It should have been a happy occasion. I was in the kitchen helping Martha prepare the meal when Thomas's wife, Sarah, came in looking for a glass of water. Sarah and I had always gotten along well during our brief encounters, and we started chatting while Martha stepped out to check on something in the living room. Sarah seemed nervous, which I attributed to the stress of travelling with young children, but then she said something that stopped me cold. She asked me how I was really doing, and whether James was still seeing his therapist. I had no idea what she was talking about. James didn't see a therapist, at least not as far as I knew. I must have looked confused because Sarah's face immediately shifted to that expression people get when they realise they've said something they shouldn't have. She tried to backpedal, but I wasn't having it. I pressed her for details, and eventually the whole story came out. According to Sarah, James had struggled with serious mental health issues throughout his 20s, including a hospitalisation during his final year of college. This all supposedly happened before we met, but it was significant enough that the family had been concerned about it for years. I was stunned. James and I had been together for 11 years total. We had built a life together, made major decisions together, shared everything with each other. Or so I thought. I had never heard a single word about any mental health struggles or hospitalizations. When I confronted James later that evening, he tried to deny it at first. But when he saw that I already knew enough to know he was lying, he finally admitted the truth. Yes, he had been hospitalized during college. Yes, he had struggled with mental health issues. And yes, he had deliberately kept this from me because he was afraid of how I would react. But here's what made it worse. His entire family had been in on it. Martha and Richard knew. Thomas and Sarah knew. Everyone had agreed to maintain the secret because James had convinced them that I would leave him if I found out. I felt like such a fool. All those family gatherings, all those conversations, all those moments of feeling like part of the family, and the whole time they were all keeping something major from me. They had looked me in the eyes and acted like everything was normal while actively deceiving me. The mental health issues themselves weren't the problem. I would have supported James through anything if he had been honest with me from the beginning. What I couldn't accept was the conspiracy of silence. The fact that an entire family had decided I couldn't be trusted with the truth about my own husband. James begged me to understand. He said he had been terrified of losing me, that his previous girlfriend had broken up with him after learning about his hospitalization, and that he had convinced himself that keeping me in the dark was the only way to protect our relationship. But here's the thing about lies that are meant to protect relationships. They actually destroy them, because once the truth comes out, and it always does, you're not just dealing with the original issue anymore. You're dealing with years of deception on top of it. You're wondering what else they might have lied about. You're questioning every memory, every conversation, every moment of intimacy. We tried couples therapy. James was finally honest with me about everything, including the details of his struggles and his ongoing mental health management. I tried to move past the betrayal, to focus on the fact that he was a good husband in many ways, and that he had been motivated by fear rather than malice. But the trust never fully came back. Every time James told me something, a little voice in the back of my head wondered if it was true. Every time I saw his parents, I remembered that they had looked me in the eyes for years while hiding something significant about their son. The conspiracy of silence had poisoned everything. We ended up divorcing after 2 more years of trying to make it work. The irony is that James's mental health struggles were never the issue. I would have stayed with him through anything if he had just been honest with me. What I couldn't stay through was the realization that the man I married didn't trust me enough to share his true self with me. I'm remarried now to someone who believes in honesty even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. My current husband knows everything about my past, and I know everything about his. There are no secrets between us, no family conspiracies, no lies of omission, and that makes all the difference. This story reminds me how families can sometimes do more harm than good when they think they're protecting someone. Let me share another perspective on family drama that shows how entitlement can tear relationships apart. This next story involves a mother-in-law who felt entitled to control every aspect of her daughter-in-law's pregnancy and the devastating consequences that followed. I married my husband, Mark, when we were both 26. His mother, Patricia, had always been what I would call difficult. She had very specific ideas about how things should be done and wasn't shy about sharing her opinions. During our wedding planning, she tried to change the venue, the caterer, and the colour scheme. I managed to hold my ground on most things, but it set the tone for our relationship going forward. When I got pregnant with our first child, Patricia's behaviour escalated to a whole new level. She had opinions about everything from what I should eat to what doctor I should see to what names we should consider. I tried to be patient and diplomatic, reminding myself that this was her first grandchild and she was probably just excited. But then Patricia crossed a line that I couldn't forgive. I was about 7 months pregnant when I developed gestational diabetes. It's a common condition, manageable with diet and monitoring, but it meant I had to be very careful about what I ate. My doctor gave me specific guidelines, and I followed them religiously. Patricia disagreed with my dietary restrictions. She thought my doctor was being overly cautious, that a little sugar wouldn't hurt anyone, and that I was being dramatic about the whole thing. She kept pushing food on me that I wasn't supposed to eat, and when I declined, she would get offended and accuse me of rejecting her hospitality. The incident that changed everything happened at a family dinner. Patricia had made her famous chocolate cake for dessert, and when I politely declined a slice, she got upset. She went on a rant about how my generation was too obsessed with rules and regulations, how women had been having babies for thousands of years without all these restrictions, and how a piece of cake wasn't going to hurt anyone. I explained, again, that I had gestational diabetes and couldn't eat the cake. She rolled her eyes and said that she had read online that gestational diabetes was overdiagnosed and that I was probably fine. She then said something that made my blood run cold. She said she had been putting extra sugar in the dishes she brought me for the past 2 weeks to prove that my doctor was wrong. She had been deliberately sabotaging my diet. For 2 weeks. While I was pregnant and managing a condition that could seriously affect my baby if not controlled properly. I was so shocked that I couldn't even respond at first. Mark, to his credit, immediately stood up and confronted his mother. He demanded to know what she had put in the food and when. Patricia tried to backtrack, saying she had just added a little bit, nothing serious, but the damage was done. I called my doctor that night, explained what had happened, and went in for an emergency checkup the next day. Fortunately, my blood sugar levels were still within an acceptable range, probably because I had been compensating in other areas without realizing it. But it could have been so much worse. Uncontrolled gestational diabetes can cause serious complications, including premature birth, breathing problems for the baby, and increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes later in life. I told Mark that I would not be seeing his mother again until after the baby was born. And even then, she would never be alone with our child, not after what she had done. She had prioritized being right over the health and safety of her grandchild. She had deliberately tried to prove me wrong by potentially putting my pregnancy at risk. Patricia didn't take this well. She called Mark constantly, crying about how I was overreacting, how she hadn't meant any harm, how she was being punished for trying to help. She rallied other family members to her side, painting me as the villain who was keeping a loving grandmother away from her grandchild. The pressure was immense. Mark's siblings called us, his aunts and uncles called us, even some of his cousins who I had barely met reached out to say that we were being too harsh on poor Patricia. Nobody seemed to care about what she had actually done. They just saw an upset grandmother and automatically assumed the daughter-in-law must be the problem. Our baby was born healthy, thank goodness. A beautiful boy we named Daniel. But the conflict with Patricia had permanently damaged our relationship with that side of the family. We eventually allowed supervised visits, meaning Patricia could see Daniel only when Mark or I was present, but the warmth and closeness that had existed before was gone. Patricia passed away 3 years later from cancer. I know some people would expect me to feel guilty for having maintained my boundaries until the end, but I don't. She made a choice to put my pregnancy at risk because she thought she knew better than my doctor. That's not something I can forgive just because she's no longer here to apologize for it. The lesson I learned from this experience is that setting boundaries is not the same as being cruel. I had every right to protect myself and my child from someone who had demonstrated that she was willing to put us in danger to prove a point. The people who criticized me for those boundaries were prioritizing family harmony over my safety, which is their choice to make, but it's not one I have to accept. If someone in your life is crossing lines that affect your health or safety, it's okay to distance yourself from them. It's okay to prioritize your well-being over their feelings. Blood relation doesn't give anyone the right to put you at risk, and you don't owe forgiveness to people who aren't sorry for what they've done. These stories keep showing us different facets of betrayal and deception. Let me continue with another tale that demonstrates how lies can spiral out of control and destroy multiple relationships at once. This one comes from a man who discovered that his best friend had been lying to him, to his wife, and to everyone else in their social circle for years. I had been best friends with a guy named Chris since we were kids. We grew up in the same neighborhood, went to the same schools, and stayed close even after we went to different colleges. He was the best man at my wedding, and I was the best man at his. Our wives became friends, our kids played together, and we spent holidays as an extended family unit. Chris was the kind of friend everyone wished they had. He was loyal, supportive, always there when you needed him. When I went through a rough patch at work, he helped me network and find new opportunities. When my father passed away, he was the first person at my door, ready to do whatever I needed. I trusted him completely, maybe more than I had ever trusted anyone outside of my immediate family. The truth about Chris came out in the most unexpected way. His wife Amanda called me one evening and asked if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us, without Chris or my wife, Lauren. She sounded strange on the phone, like she had been crying, but she wouldn't tell me what was wrong. When we met the next day, Amanda dropped a bomb that I wasn't prepared for. She told me that she had discovered Chris had been having an affair. Not a recent one, but one that had been going on for almost 5 years. 5 years. That was longer than he and Amanda had been married. I was shocked, of course, but what Amanda told me next was even more devastating. The woman Chris was having an affair with was someone I knew, someone everyone in our friend group knew. It was the wife of another friend from our social circle, a guy named David who we regularly hung out with. Chris had been having an affair with David's wife for 5 years. During that time, he had been the picture of a devoted husband and friend. He had stood beside David at David's daughter's baptism. He had helped Amanda plan surprise parties and romantic getaways. He had looked all of us in the eyes, week after week, year after year, while carrying on this secret relationship right under everyone's noses. Amanda had found out through text messages. She had borrowed Chris's phone because hers was dead, and a message had come through while she was using it. One message led to another, and soon she had uncovered the entire history of his affair. I didn't know what to say to Amanda. I was furious on her behalf, of course, but I was also reeling from my own sense of betrayal. Chris was my best friend. I had trusted him with everything. I had shared my deepest fears and secrets with him, believing that he was someone worthy of that trust. And the whole time, he had been living this double life, deceiving not just Amanda, but David and the rest of us as well. The fallout was catastrophic. Amanda confronted Chris, who tried to deny it at first, but eventually admitted everything. David found out from Amanda before Chris had a chance to come clean, which made the whole situation even uglier. Marriages fell apart, friendships dissolved. Our entire social circle, which had been so tight-knit and supportive, splintered into factions. I couldn't stay friends with Chris after that. Some people told me I was being too harsh, that his affair was his and Amanda's business, not mine. But it wasn't just about the affair. It was about the fundamental dishonesty. If Chris could maintain such an elaborate deception for 5 years, how could I trust anything he had ever said to me? How could I believe that our friendship had been genuine when he was capable of that level of sustained betrayal? Chris tried to reach out to me several times after everything fell apart. He wanted to explain, to apologize, to salvage our friendship. I couldn't do it. Every time I thought about having a conversation with him, I pictured all those moments we had shared over the years, all the times he had looked me in the eyes and lied by omission. The trust was gone, and without trust, what was the point? It's been several years now since all of this happened. Chris and Amanda divorced. David and his wife divorced as well, though I heard she and Chris didn't even stay together after everything came out, which made the whole mess even more pointless. Our friend group never recovered. We all went our separate ways, scattered by the revelation that one of our own had been deceiving us all. I sometimes wonder if Chris ever thinks about what he lost. Not just his marriage, but the friendships, the community, the sense of belonging. Was the affair worth it? Was whatever temporary pleasure or excitement he got from that relationship worth destroying so many others? I don't have answers to those questions. All I know is that the experience taught me that you can never really know someone, no matter how long you've been friends. People are capable of compartmentalizing in ways that are almost incomprehensible. The person who seems most trustworthy might be the one hiding the biggest secrets. Let's take a moment to breathe here. These stories are intense, I know. The common thread running through all of them is the devastating power of deception. When people we trust turn out to be liars, it doesn't just hurt in the moment. It changes how we see the world, how we approach relationships, how we decide who to let in. But it's important to remember that for every story of betrayal, there are countless stories of genuine love and trust. Most people are not living double lives or deliberately deceiving their partners. Most friendships are exactly what they appear to be. The stories I share here are outliers, the extreme cases that stand out precisely because they're unusual. Still, these cautionary tales serve a purpose. They remind us to pay attention to our instincts, to ask questions when something feels wrong, and to value honesty in our relationships above almost everything else. Because at the end of the day, a relationship built on lies is not a relationship at all. It's a fiction, and fiction always eventually gives way to reality. Let me share another story that illustrates this point in a different way. This one involves a woman who discovered that her sister had been lying about something that affected the entire family. I grew up as the middle child in a family of 3 sisters. My older sister, Megan, was always the golden child. She was beautiful, smart, successful in everything she tried. My younger sister, Hannah, and I were both in her shadow, but we didn't really mind. Megan wasn't arrogant about her achievements. She was actually very humble and supportive, always encouraging us to pursue our own goals. Megan got married at 25 to a man named Eric, who seemed perfect for her. He was handsome, successful, devoted to her. They had 2 beautiful children and a gorgeous house in a nice neighborhood. Their Christmas cards looked like they belonged in a magazine. Everyone in our family held them up as the example of what marriage should look like. But behind closed doors, things were very different. I found out the truth when Megan showed up at my apartment at 2 a.m, sobbing uncontrollably. She had left Eric, she told me, and she was never going back. When I asked what had happened, the story that came out was one of the most shocking things I had ever heard from someone I thought I knew so well. Eric had been abusing Megan for almost their entire marriage. Not physically, at least not at first, but emotionally and psychologically. He controlled everything she did, from what she wore to who she talked to. He isolated her from her friends and made her dependent on him for every decision. He criticized her constantly, told her she was worthless, made her believe that no one else would ever want her. The physical abuse started about 3 years in. A slap here, a shove there, nothing that left visible marks, at least at first. Megan convinced herself it wasn't that bad, that all couples had problems, that Eric was under a lot of stress at work. She was too ashamed to tell anyone what was really happening. For nearly 10 years, Megan had been presenting a perfect image to the world while living in what she described as a nightmare. Those beautiful Christmas cards, staged photo shoots that often ended in screaming matches, those stories about romantic date nights, fabrications designed to maintain the illusion. Every time our family praised her marriage, Megan died a little inside, but she kept the act going because she was terrified of what would happen if the truth came out. I was devastated, not just for Megan, but also because I realized that I had been completely blind to her suffering. I had seen her regularly for almost a decade and never noticed anything was wrong. I had bought into the perfect image without ever questioning it. I had failed her as a sister. When I asked Megan why she had never told me, never asked for help, she said something that broke my heart. She said she had tried to tell me once, years ago, but I had brushed it off. I had been going through something difficult at the time and had changed the subject to talk about my own problems. She never tried again. I don't remember that conversation. I have no memory of Megan trying to reach out or of me shutting her down, but I believe her. I was probably so wrapped up in my own life that I didn't pick up on the signs. I had probably dismissed some vague hint as Megan just venting about normal marriage stuff, and that dismissal had contributed to 10 more years of suffering. Megan is doing better now. She left Eric, went through a difficult divorce, and rebuilt her life. She's in therapy, working through the trauma, learning to trust herself and others again. The kids are adjusting, though it's been hard for them to understand why their family fell apart. But the experience changed how I approach relationships with the people I love. I pay attention now. When someone seems off, I ask about it. When someone tries to tell me something, I listen, really listen, instead of waiting for my turn to talk. I learned that sometimes the people presenting the most perfect exterior are the ones struggling the most, and that being present and attentive can literally save lives. If someone in your life seems like they might be going through something, don't assume that they're fine just because they say they are. Ask specific questions. Be persistent. Let them know that you're a safe person to confide in. You might be the only lifeline they have. We've covered a lot of ground tonight, from romantic betrayal to family secrets to hidden abuse. All of these stories share a common element, the devastating consequences of deception. But I want to end on a slightly different note with a story about how discovering the truth, even when it's painful, can ultimately lead to healing and growth. This final story comes from someone who found out their entire childhood had been based on a lie, and how they eventually came to terms with that discovery. I was raised by a single mother in a small apartment in Chicago. My father, according to my mother, had been a wonderful man who died in a car accident when I was just 2 years old. She kept a photo of him on her nightstand, told me stories about how he had loved me more than anything, and made sure I knew that even though he was gone, his love lived on through me. I built my entire identity around being Marcus Williams Jr., named after a father I had never known but who had supposedly been a hero. My mother told me he had been a firefighter, that he had saved lives, that he had been respected and admired by everyone who knew him. I grew up wanting to be just like him, eventually becoming a firefighter myself, in what I thought was a tribute to his memory. The truth came out when I was 32 years old. My mother was hospitalized with what turned out to be terminal cancer, and in her final weeks, she decided to tell me something she had kept secret my entire life. Marcus Williams Sr. wasn't dead. He had never been a firefighter, and he hadn't died in a car accident. The truth was far more complicated and far more painful. My father had been a young man. My mother had dated briefly in college. When she got pregnant, he wanted nothing to do with her or the baby. He had offered to pay for an abortion, and when my mother refused, he had simply vanished from her life. The photos she had shown me were of her older brother, who had passed away before I was born. The stories she had told me were complete fabrications. My mother explained that she had lied because she wanted me to have a father to look up to. She couldn't bear to tell me that my real father was a man who had rejected me before I was even born. So she created a hero for me to admire, gave me a name to be proud of, and maintained the fiction for over 3 decades. I don't know how to describe what I felt when she told me this. It was like the floor beneath my entire life had suddenly disappeared. Everything I thought I knew about myself, my identity, my purpose, was built on a lie. I wasn't Marcus Williams Jr., I was just some guy whose father hadn't wanted him. I went through a very difficult period after my mother died. I was angry at her for lying to me, angry at my biological father for abandoning me, and angry at myself for never questioning the story. How had I not figured it out? How had I built my entire career around emulating a man who had never existed? But eventually, with therapy and time, I came to understand something important. The lie my mother had told me wasn't about her. It was about me. She had looked at her innocent baby and decided that I deserved to believe I was loved, that I came from something good, that I had a legacy to live up to. It was wrong, yes. It was deceptive. But it came from a place of love. And here's the thing. I am a firefighter. I did save lives. The person I became wasn't fake just because the story that inspired me was. I was still the same person, with the same values and the same accomplishments, even after learning the truth. The foundation of my identity had been built on sand, but the house I built on top of it was still real. I eventually tracked down my biological father. He's alive, living in Florida, married with kids who are technically my half-siblings. We met once. It was awkward and uncomfortable and didn't lead to any kind of relationship. He's not interested in being a father to me, and honestly, I'm okay with that now. I had a mother who loved me enough to create an entire mythology to protect me. That's more than he ever gave me. The point of this story isn't to justify lying. My mother was wrong to deceive me for 32 years. If she had told me the truth when I was old enough to understand, I could have processed it and moved on. Instead, I had to deal with both the original abandonment and the betrayal of the lie simultaneously. That was unnecessarily cruel, even if it was well-intentioned. But the point is also that we are more than our origins. We are more than the lies we were told or the truths that were hidden from us. Discovering that everything you believe was false is devastating, but it doesn't have to define you. You can acknowledge the deception, grieve what you lost, and still move forward into a future that you create for yourself. We've been through quite a journey tonight, haven't we? Stories of partners who lived double lives, families who kept devastating secrets, friends who betrayed trust, and parents who rewrote history to protect their children. The common thread through all of them is the complex, messy, sometimes devastating nature of human relationships. If there's one thing I hope you take away from tonight's stories, it's this. Honesty matters. It matters more than protecting feelings, more than avoiding conflict, more than keeping up appearances. The people who lied in these stories all had their reasons, some selfish and some well-intentioned, but the results were the same. Broken trust, shattered relationships, years of pain that could have been avoided. If you're keeping a secret from someone you love, think carefully about whether that secret is worth the cost. Think about what will happen when the truth comes out, because it almost always does. And think about what kind of person you want to be. Someone who tells comfortable lies, or someone who tells difficult truths. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I hope these stories gave you something to think about, and I hope your own relationships are built on foundations of honesty and trust. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing for more content like this. And remember, there's always more to explore in the vast world of human experiences. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one. Before I go, I want to share just a few more stories that came across my radar this week. These are a bit lighter than some of the others, but they still touch on themes of trust, honesty, and the surprising ways people can let us down. This first one comes from someone whose roommate turned out to be living a completely different life than what they had presented. I moved to the city after college for a new job and needed to find a place to live quickly. I found a roommate listing online that seemed perfect. The apartment was nice, the rent was reasonable, and the current tenant, a guy named Derek, seemed normal during our video chat. We agreed that I would move in at the beginning of the following month. When I arrived, Derek was friendly and helped me get settled. He told me he worked in finance, kept normal hours, and generally kept to himself. Perfect roommate material, I thought. The first few weeks were fine. Derek was polite, cleaned up after himself, and didn't make too much noise. But then I started noticing little things that didn't add up. Derek claimed to work at a major bank downtown, but I never saw him leave for work at a consistent time. Sometimes he would leave at 6 in the morning, sometimes at noon, and sometimes he didn't seem to leave at all. When I mentioned something about his job once, he gave vague answers that didn't quite make sense for someone working in finance. I also noticed that Derek got a lot of packages. Like, a lot. Multiple packages every day, from all different retailers. He would take them to his room and I never saw what was inside. When I joked about his online shopping habit, he got weirdly defensive and changed the subject. The truth came out about 4 months into our living arrangement. I came home early from work one day because I wasn't feeling well, and I found our apartment completely transformed. The living room was set up like a photography studio, with professional lighting, backdrops, and camera equipment everywhere. Derek was in the middle of what appeared to be a product photo shoot. It turned out that Derek wasn't a finance guy at all. He was what people call an influencer, and he made his living by partnering with brands to promote products on social media. All those packages were free stuff from companies hoping he would feature their products. The vague schedule made sense because his job involved creating content at home, not going to an office. Now, being an influencer isn't inherently problematic. It's a legitimate career for many people. What bothered me was that Derek had lied about it. When I asked him why, he got defensive and said that people judge influencers and he didn't want to deal with the stigma. He said he had told previous roommates the truth and they had been weird about it, so he started just telling people he worked in finance instead. I understood his reasoning, but it still felt like a betrayal of trust. We were living together, sharing a space, and he had lied about something basic like what he did for a living. It made me wonder what else he might be lying about. We had a long conversation about honesty and boundaries. Derek apologized for not being upfront, and we established new ground rules about communication. The rest of our time as roommates was actually fine, and we even developed a good friendship, but I never fully trusted him the way I might have if he had been honest from the beginning. The lesson here is that even small lies can damage trust. Derek didn't lie about anything major. His job wasn't hurting anyone, and his reason for lying was understandable. But starting a living arrangement with deception created a foundation of uncertainty that never fully went away. Here's another story that shows how entitlement and dishonesty can destroy workplace relationships. I worked at a marketing firm where one of my colleagues, a woman named Jessica, was known for taking credit for other people's work. It was one of those open secrets that everyone knew about but no one had the power to stop. Jessica had a pattern. She would volunteer to lead group projects, delegate most of the actual work to others, and then present the final results to management as if she had done everything herself. She was charming and articulate, so her presentations always went over well. Meanwhile, the people who had actually done the work were rarely acknowledged. I had witnessed this behaviour several times, but had never been directly affected by it until we were assigned to work on a major campaign together. I put in 60-hour weeks for 2 months, developing strategy, creating content, and coordinating with clients. Jessica attended maybe half of the meetings and contributed almost nothing of substance. When it came time to present to the executive team, Jessica somehow ended up being the one to deliver the presentation. I was supposed to present alongside her, but she engineered a last-minute change by claiming that having 2 presenters would be confusing. Our manager, who was generally oblivious to Jessica's tactics, agreed. I watched from the back of the room as Jessica presented my work as if she had done it all herself. She used the first-person singular the entire time. I developed this strategy. I came up with this concept. I coordinated with the client. Not once did she mention my name or acknowledge my contributions. I was furious, but I didn't know what to do. Confronting Jessica directly seemed pointless since she had already demonstrated she had no shame. Going to management felt risky since Jessica was well liked and I was relatively new, so I did something that I'm not entirely proud of, but that ultimately worked out. I started keeping meticulous records of everything I did. Every email, every document, every timestamp. When the campaign ended up being successful and Jessica was nominated for an internal award, I requested a meeting with our manager and presented my evidence. Pages and pages of documentation showing that the work Jessica had claimed as her own was actually mine. Our manager was initially skeptical, but the evidence was overwhelming. Email chains showed that I had originated the ideas Jessica had presented. Document version histories showed that I had created the files Jessica had taken credit for. Time tracking data showed that I had logged hundreds of hours while Jessica had logged maybe 30. Jessica was confronted about the discrepancy. She tried to claim that she had been supervising my work and that presenting as the team lead was normal. But the evidence didn't support that narrative. She hadn't made substantive contributions at any stage of the project. She had simply swooped in at the end and claimed credit. The aftermath was complicated. Jessica wasn't fired, but she was removed from the running for the award, which went to me instead. She was also put on a performance improvement plan that required her to document her individual contributions to any project she worked on. Within 6 months, she had left the company for a position elsewhere. I felt vindicated, but I also learned something important about workplace dynamics. People like Jessica exist in every organization, and they thrive when others stay silent. If I had simply accepted her theft of my work without pushing back, it would have continued indefinitely. Sometimes you have to advocate for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable. The workplace can be such a complicated environment for trust and honesty. Let me share one more story from that context before we wrap up. This one involves a manager who was secretly working against his own team for personal gain. I worked in sales for a tech company where my manager, a guy named Robert, was widely respected. He had been with the company for over a decade, had helped build the department from scratch, and was considered a mentor to many of the younger salespeople, including me. Robert always seemed to have our best interests at heart. He advocated for better commissions, pushed back against unreasonable quotas, and went to bat for us with upper management. When I was struggling with a difficult client, he spent hours coaching me through the situation. I genuinely thought he was one of the good ones. The truth came out during a company reorganization that led to the discovery of some irregularities in our department's records. An internal audit revealed that Robert had been skimming money off the top of our commissions for years. Here's how it worked. When we closed a deal, the commission was supposed to be calculated based on the total sale amount. Robert had access to the accounting system and had been manually adjusting the calculations downward before they were processed. The difference went into a personal account he had set up using company resources. Over the course of several years, he had stolen tens of thousands of dollars from the people he was supposed to be managing. The revelation was devastating. All those times Robert had advocated for better commissions, he was advocating for increases to the pool he was stealing from. All those hours he spent mentoring us, he was cultivating loyal employees who would never think to question him. The entire persona of the supportive manager had been a front for financial fraud. Robert was fired and faced legal consequences. The company offered back pay to everyone affected, which was something, but it couldn't undo the sense of betrayal we all felt. I had trusted this man. I had defended him to colleagues who had expressed vague suspicions. I had recommended him for an award that he ended up winning, which now felt like a cruel joke. The experience made me much more skeptical of authority figures in the workplace. I don't assume anymore that someone in a leadership position has my best interests at heart. I verify information, ask questions, and pay attention to discrepancies that I might have ignored before. It's exhausting, but it's better than being blindsided again. These stories from the workplace remind us that deception can happen in any context, not just our personal relationships. The same principles apply though. Pay attention to your instincts. Ask questions when something doesn't feel right, and don't assume that someone is trustworthy just because they hold a position of authority. We've covered so much ground tonight. From partners who led double lives to families who kept devastating secrets, from workplace betrayals to roommate deceptions. The stories are different in their specifics, but they all point to the same fundamental truth. Honesty is the foundation of every meaningful relationship, and without it, even the most seemingly solid connections can crumble. I want to thank you all for joining me on this journey through these intense and sometimes difficult stories. I know some of them were heavy, and I appreciate you sticking with me through all of it. These kinds of stories matter because they remind us that we're not alone in our experiences of betrayal and disappointment. They also remind us of the importance of being the kind of person who others can trust. As you go about your life tomorrow and in the days to come, I hope you'll carry some of these lessons with you. Be honest with the people you love, even when it's hard. Pay attention to the signs when something feels off. And remember that while deception is always destructive, the discovery of truth, no matter how painful, is ultimately the first step toward healing. Thank you for watching, thank you for your support, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care of yourselves, everyone. Actually, before we wrap up completely, I want to share a few more stories that really struck me this week. These touch on some different themes, but they all tie back to the idea of discovering uncomfortable truths about people we thought we knew. This next one comes from someone who found out their childhood best friend had been spreading lies about them for years without them knowing. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone. My best friend from elementary school through high school was a girl named Brittany. We did everything together. We had sleepovers every weekend, took the same classes, joined the same clubs. I considered her closer than a sister. After high school, we went to different colleges, but stayed in touch. The friendship wasn't as close as it had been, which was normal and expected. People grow apart when they're in different cities, living different lives. But we still texted regularly and saw each other during holidays, when we were both home visiting our families. About 5 years after graduation, I moved back to our hometown for a job opportunity. I was excited to reconnect with Brittany, who had also returned after college. I imagined us picking up right where we left off, recapturing some of that closeness we had had as teenagers. But something was off. When I reached out to Brittany, she was friendly but distant. When I tried to make plans, she always seemed to have something else going on. And when I ran into mutual friends from high school, they acted strangely around me, like they knew something I didn't. Eventually, I found out what was going on. Another friend, someone who had been on the periphery of our social circle in high school, pulled me aside and told me the truth. Brittany had been telling people for years that I had betrayed her in some major way. The specifics varied depending on who she was talking to, but the general narrative was that I had done something unforgivable, and that's why our friendship had faded. I was completely blindsided. I racked my brain trying to figure out what I could have done to hurt Brittany, but I couldn't come up with anything. Our friendship hadn't ended with any dramatic confrontation. We had simply grown apart, like most high school friendships do. There was no betrayal, no falling out, nothing. I confronted Brittany about what I had heard. Her reaction confirmed everything. She didn't deny spreading the stories. Instead, she tried to justify them by saying that she had felt abandoned when I went to a different college, and that she needed a way to explain our changing relationship to our mutual friends. Rather than admitting that we had simply grown apart, she had created a narrative that made her the victim and me the villain. I was furious. She had been telling people that I had betrayed her for almost a decade. People I had known my whole life had been looking at me differently because of lies she had spread. Opportunities for reconnection, for friendship, for community had been poisoned by her fabrications. What hurt most was that I would have been there for her if she had just been honest about feeling abandoned. I would have tried to maintain the friendship more actively if I had known how much it mattered to her. Instead, she had chosen to lie about me rather than communicate with me. I cut Brittany out of my life after that conversation. There's no coming back from that kind of betrayal. She had assassinated my character to protect her own ego, and in doing so, she had damaged relationships I didn't even know I was losing. The lesson I took from this experience is that some people would rather create a narrative that makes them look good than deal with uncomfortable truths about themselves. Brittany couldn't accept that our friendship had simply run its course, so she rewrote history to cast herself as the injured party. And the crazy thing is, it worked for years. People believed her because they had no reason not to. If you find out that someone has been spreading lies about you, don't assume everyone already knows the truth. People believe what they're told, especially when it comes from someone they trust. Sometimes you have to actively counter false narratives, even when it feels uncomfortable to do so. Here's another story that shows how discovering the truth can completely change your perception of a seemingly normal situation. This one comes from a man who realized that his girlfriend's best friend had been secretly undermining their relationship for years. I had been dating a woman named Claire for about 3 years. We were serious, talking about marriage and kids, planning for a future together. Claire had a best friend named Megan who she had known since childhood. The two of them were inseparable, and I had accepted that Megan would always be a big part of Claire's life. I got along with Megan well enough, or so I thought. She was always friendly to my face, included me in their activities, and seemed supportive of our relationship. But there were times when Claire would come home from hanging out with Megan in a strange mood, more critical of me than usual, questioning things about our relationship that had never seemed to bother her before. I chalked it up to normal relationship dynamics. Everyone has moments of doubt, and friends sometimes plant seeds of worry without meaning to. I didn't think too much about it. The truth came out when Claire and I hit a rough patch. We were arguing more frequently, struggling to communicate, and seriously considering whether we had a future together. During one particularly difficult conversation, Claire said something that stopped me cold. She said that Megan had been telling her for years that I wasn't good enough for her, that she could do better, that I was holding her back. I was stunned. Megan had been actively working against our relationship for years. Every time she had smiled at me and acted friendly, she had been going behind my back to convince Claire to leave me. Claire confirmed it. Megan had been making comments about me for as long as we had been together. Little jabs disguised as jokes. Comparisons to other men who were supposedly better options. Planted seeds of doubt that had grown over time into full-fledged concerns. And Claire had been listening, absorbing these criticisms, without ever telling me they were happening. I felt betrayed on multiple levels. Betrayed by Megan, obviously, who had been undermining me while pretending to be friendly. But also betrayed by Claire, who had been letting it happen without defending me or even warning me about what was going on. Claire and I had a very long conversation about what this meant for our relationship. She apologized for not standing up to Megan, for letting her best friend poison her perception of me. She said she had always known deep down that Megan was being unfair, but had convinced herself it was just normal friend stuff. We ended up working through it, but our relationship with Megan was over. Claire confronted her about what she had been doing, and Megan's response was revealing. She didn't deny any of it. She said she had never thought I was right for Claire, and had been trying to help her see that for years. She seemed genuinely confused that this was a problem. Some people have a warped sense of friendship. In Megan's mind, she was being a good friend by trying to protect Claire from what she perceived as a bad relationship. She never considered that she might be wrong, that I might actually be a good partner for Claire, or that her constant criticism was doing more harm than good. Claire and Megan's friendship never recovered. The betrayal was too deep. And honestly, I think that's for the best. A friend who actively works to destroy your relationship isn't really a friend at all. If someone in your partner's life seems to be consistently negative about your relationship, pay attention to that. Don't dismiss it as just friend stuff. Talk to your partner about what's being said and how it's affecting them. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones doing the most damage. Let me share one more story about discovering uncomfortable truths, this one involving a family business and the secrets hidden within it. I grew up in a family that owned a successful restaurant. My parents had started it from scratch when I was a baby, and by the time I was in high school, it had become a local institution. They employed dozens of people, were respected in the community, and had built what seemed like a legitimate success story. I worked at the restaurant throughout my teenage years, doing everything from bussing tables to helping in the kitchen. My parents always talked about how I would eventually take over the business, carrying on their legacy. I took pride in that, studied business in college specifically to prepare for it, and came back home after graduation ready to start my journey toward ownership. But as I took on more responsibility at the restaurant, I started noticing things that didn't add up. The books seemed off in ways I couldn't quite explain. Suppliers I'd never heard of were receiving regular payments, and there were cash transactions that weren't being properly recorded. I brought my concerns to my father, expecting him to explain away my confusion. Instead, his face went pale, and he pulled me into his office for a private conversation. What he told me changed everything I thought I knew about my family and our business. The restaurant had been struggling for years, much longer than I had realized. My parents had been barely breaking even for most of my childhood, and in my early teenage years they had started cutting corners to stay afloat. At first it was small things, like paying some workers under the table to avoid payroll taxes. Then it escalated to more serious violations, like underreporting income and making deals with suppliers who provided stolen goods. My father justified it by saying they had no choice. The restaurant was everything they had. Without it, we would have lost our home, our savings, everything. So they did what they had to do to survive. I was devastated. The business I had been planning to inherit, the legacy I was supposed to carry on, was built on a foundation of fraud. All those years of watching my parents as examples of hard work and integrity, and the whole time they had been breaking the law, I had to make a difficult decision. Do I report what I had learned, potentially destroying my parents and everything they had built? Do I take over the business knowing what it was really built on? Or do I walk away and pretend I never found out? I chose to walk away. I couldn't be part of a business that operated the way ours did, but I also couldn't bring myself to report my own parents. It felt cowardly, and maybe it was, but I didn't know what else to do. I moved to another city, started a career in a completely different field, and rarely went home to visit. My relationship with my parents became strained. They felt abandoned. I felt betrayed. Neither of us could really talk about what had happened or why. The restaurant was eventually shut down a few years later when an audit uncovered some of the irregularities. My parents faced legal consequences, though they avoided prison due to their age and the relatively small scale of the fraud compared to what it could have been. The community that had celebrated them was shocked and disappointed. I sometimes wonder if things would have been different if I had found out earlier, if I could have convinced them to go straight before it was too late. But I also know that the problems had been there for years before I discovered them. The lies had been in place long before I was old enough to understand what was happening. The experience taught me that success isn't always what it appears to be. Some of the people we admire most are hiding secrets that would change how we see them entirely. That doesn't mean we should be cynical about everyone, but it does mean we shouldn't assume that someone's public image reflects their private reality. These stories we've shared tonight all circle back to the same fundamental truth about human nature. We are complex creatures capable of both great love and great deception. The people who hurt us most are often the ones we trusted most deeply, and the discoveries that shatter our world are usually hiding in plain sight, waiting for the moment when we finally allow ourselves to see them. But there's hope in these stories too. The people who shared them survived their betrayals. They rebuilt their lives, learned from their experiences, and found ways to trust again, even if that trust was more cautious than before. That resilience is part of what makes us human. If you're going through something similar, if you've recently discovered a painful truth about someone you trusted, know that you're not alone. Know that what you're feeling is valid, and know that while the pain might seem unbearable now, it will eventually become something you can carry. Healing isn't linear. Some days will be harder than others, but eventually you'll find yourself on the other side, stronger and wiser for what you've been through. Thank you again for joining me tonight. These stories matter because they remind us of our shared humanity, of the capacity we all have for both hurting and healing. If you found value in tonight's video, please consider subscribing and sharing it with others who might benefit from these lessons. Take care of yourselves, be kind to each other, and remember that honesty, even when it's difficult, is always better than comfortable lies. Good night, everyone. Sweet dreams. But wait, since you're still here, let me share just a couple more quick stories that I came across this week. These are shorter but equally impactful in their own way. This first one involves a woman who discovered that her sister had been copying her entire life for years. I'm the younger of two sisters, and for most of my life, I looked up to my older sister Samantha. She always seemed more confident, more put together, more sure of herself. I wanted to be like her in many ways. But as I got older and started living my own life, making my own choices, I noticed something strange. Samantha started copying me, not in small ways, but in significant, life-altering decisions. When I decided to go to nursing school, Samantha suddenly discovered a passion for nursing and enrolled in a program 6 months later. When I started dating a guy who worked in tech, Samantha broke up with her boyfriend and started exclusively dating men in tech. When I got a specific breed of dog, Samantha got the same breed within a year. When I decorated my apartment in a certain style, Samantha's place suddenly looked remarkably similar. At first, I thought it was coincidence or flattery. Sisters often have similar tastes, right? But it kept happening. Every major decision I made, Samantha would follow. It was like she was living her life one step behind mine, copying my homework without even trying to hide it. The final straw came when I got engaged. I had been with my partner for several years, and when he proposed, I was over the moon. I shared the news with my family, including Samantha, who had been single for a while. Within 3 months, Samantha was also engaged, to a man she had been dating for less than 6 months, a man who, I couldn't help but notice, bore a striking resemblance to my fiancé and worked in a similar field. I confronted Samantha about what I had been observing. Her reaction was defensive at first, then tearful. She admitted that she had been using my life as a template for her own because she didn't know how to make decisions for herself. She said that watching me succeed made her feel like she could succeed too, but only if she followed the same path. It was sad, honestly. My accomplished, confident older sister was actually deeply insecure and had been using me as a blueprint because she didn't trust herself to figure out her own life. We had several long conversations after that, and Samantha eventually started therapy to work through her issues. She ended up calling off her engagement because she realized she had rushed into it just to keep up with me. It was painful for everyone involved, but ultimately necessary. The lesson here is that imitation isn't always flattery. Sometimes it's a sign that someone is struggling in ways you can't see. If you notice someone in your life copying your decisions in an unusual way, it might be worth having a gentle conversation about it. They might be going through something that needs attention. And finally, here's a brief story about discovering that a mentor had been taking advantage of their position. I had a professor in graduate school who I absolutely idolized. Dr. Harrison was brilliant, published in all the top journals, and took me under his wing during my second year. He advocated for me, introduced me to important people in our field, and seemed genuinely invested in my success. I felt so lucky to have found such a supportive mentor. Not everyone in academia is so generous with their time and connections. Dr. Harrison was the exception, and I was grateful. The truth came out near the end of my program. Another student confided in me that Dr. Harrison had been adding his name to research he hadn't contributed to, research done by graduate students who felt they couldn't say no because he controlled their careers. The advocacy and introductions weren't acts of generosity. They were investments. He expected returns in the form of unearned authorship credits and professional benefits. I felt sick when I realized that this included me. Work I had done, research I had spent years on, was being credited to someone who had contributed little more than his name and reputation. And because I had been so grateful for his mentorship, I had never questioned why his name appeared on papers he hadn't helped write. I wish I could say I confronted him or reported him, but I didn't. I was too close to finishing my degree, too dependent on his support for my job search. I swallowed my anger, played along until graduation, and then quietly distanced myself from him as I built my career elsewhere. Dr. Harrison was eventually exposed by braver people than me years later. By then, the damage to multiple careers had already been done. I still think about whether I should have spoken up sooner, and whether my silence enabled more harm. The lesson from this experience is to be cautious of mentors who seem too good to be true. Ask questions about why they're helping you and what they expect in return. And if you discover they're taking advantage of their position, find someone you trust to talk to about it. Staying silent might feel safer in the short term, but it perpetuates the problem for future victims. Okay, now I really am wrapping up for tonight. Thank you for staying with me through all of these stories. I know they've been heavy at times, but I think there's value in hearing about other people's experiences with deception and betrayal. It helps us recognize the signs in our own lives and reminds us that we're not alone when we face these challenges. Remember to be kind to yourselves and to each other. Be honest, even when it's hard, and trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Good night, everyone. See you in the next one. Actually, you know what? I have a few more stories that I think are worth sharing before we call it a night. These ones touch on some slightly different themes, but still relate to that core idea of discovering truths about people and situations that change everything. Let me tell you about someone who discovered their online friend of several years was not who they claimed to be. I spent a lot of time in online gaming communities during my college years. It was a way to unwind, make friends, an escape from the stress of exams and papers. One of the people I became closest to was someone who went by the username Phoenix. We played together almost every night for about 4 years. Phoenix told me they were a guy around my age, living in California, working as a graphic designer. We talked about everything, from game strategies to life problems to dreams for the future. I considered Phoenix one of my best friends, even though we had never met in person or even video chatted. The truth came out when I finally suggested we meet up. I was going to be travelling to California for a work conference, and I thought it would be amazing to finally meet Phoenix in real life after all those years of friendship. Phoenix got weird about it, made excuses, said the timing wasn't right, claimed to be busy. I pushed a little bit, and eventually Phoenix admitted the truth. Phoenix wasn't a guy in California. Phoenix was actually a woman in her 50s living in Ohio. She had created the persona of a young male graphic designer because she thought no one would want to be friends with a middle-aged woman in an online gaming community. She had been lying about her identity for the entire time I had known her. I didn't know how to feel. On one hand, our friendship had been real. The conversations we had, the support we gave each other, the inside jokes we shared, none of that was fake. The person behind Phoenix was genuine in their care for me. On the other hand, I had been lied to for 4 years. I had trusted Phoenix with personal information, shared things I wouldn't have shared if I had known the truth. The foundation of our friendship was built on deception. We had a long conversation about it. She apologized profusely, explained her reasoning, and asked if we could continue being friends now that I knew the truth. I said I needed time to think about it. In the end, I decided to forgive her and try to maintain the friendship. The lie was significant, but her reasons were understandable, and the friendship itself had been real even if the details surrounding it weren't. We're still friends today, though things are different now. I know who I'm really talking to, and there's a level of authenticity in our conversations that wasn't there before. But I also learned to be more careful about online friendships. Not everyone is who they say they are, and some deceptions can go on for years before being discovered. That doesn't mean you shouldn't trust anyone online, but it does mean you should be aware that the person on the other end of the screen might not be exactly who they claim to be. Here's another story that shows how lies can spiral out of control and hurt innocent people. A friend of mine, let's call her Nina, had a complicated relationship with her mother. Her mum had always been dramatic and attention-seeking, constantly creating crises that required everyone to drop everything and help her. Nina had spent her whole life managing her mother's emotional needs, while her own went unaddressed. The biggest lie Nina's mother ever told came when Nina was in her late 20s. Her mother called her one day, sobbing, and said she had been diagnosed with cancer, stage 3. The prognosis wasn't good. She needed surgery, chemotherapy, the whole terrifying treatment plan. Nina immediately went into crisis mode. She took time off work, moved back home temporarily to help care for her mother, and devoted herself entirely to supporting her through this illness. She was devastated at the thought of losing her mom, despite their complicated relationship. But something didn't add up. Nina's mother never looked sick. She didn't seem to be going through chemotherapy. The surgery she was supposedly recovering from left no visible scars. When Nina asked questions about her treatment, her mother would get vague or change the subject. After about 6 months of this, Nina started to suspect that something was wrong. She contacted her mother's doctor, or at least the doctor her mother claimed to be seeing, and discovered that her mother was not and had never been a patient there. There was no cancer. The whole thing had been fabricated from start to finish. Nina's mother had invented a terminal illness to get attention and to force Nina to come home and take care of her. I cannot adequately describe the devastation Nina felt when she discovered the truth. She had upended her entire life, damaged her career, put relationships on hold, all to support her mother through an illness that didn't exist. The betrayal was so profound that Nina couldn't even process it at first. She just sat in shocked silence when her mother finally admitted to the lie. Nina cut off contact with her mother after that. Completely. She couldn't have a relationship with someone who would manipulate her that way, who would use the spectre of death to control her behavior. Some lies are simply unforgivable, and this was one of them. The aftermath was complicated. Other family members tried to pressure Nina into reconciling with her mother, claiming that she was clearly mentally unwell and deserved compassion. Nina understood that her mother probably did have mental health issues, but that didn't obligate Nina to subject herself to further manipulation. Understanding why someone does something harmful doesn't mean you have to accept that harm. Last I heard, Nina's mother had tried similar tactics with other family members, none of which worked as well now that people knew what she was capable of. She became increasingly isolated, which was sad but also inevitable. You can only cry wolf so many times before people stop coming to help. If someone in your life has a pattern of creating crises that demand your attention, be cautious. Ask questions. Verify information. Some people will say anything to get what they want, and they don't consider the damage they're doing to the people who care about them. Let me share one more story about discovering the truth about someone's character, this one with a slightly different flavour. This comes from a guy who found out his best friend had been betting against him in everything they did. I had a friend named Kyle who I had known since we were kids. We were competitive with each other in a healthy way, or so I thought. We'd play video games against each other, make bets on sports games, challenge each other at pool, that kind of thing. The friendly rivalry was part of what made our friendship fun. What I didn't know was that Kyle was betting on our competitions with other people, and not betting on himself to win. Betting on me to lose. I found out through a mutual friend who let it slip after a few drinks. Apparently, Kyle had a whole system going. He would suggest a competition, talk up his own skills, and get people to bet money on him. Then he would throw the game, collecting a cut of the winnings from whoever had bet on me. The worst part was that Kyle would then rub my victory in my face, acting like he was devastated to have lost. He'd say things like he couldn't believe I beat him, that he must be losing his edge, that I was getting too good. Meanwhile, he was laughing all the way to the bank. When I confronted Kyle about this, he tried to play it off as no big deal. He said it wasn't hurting anyone, that he was just finding creative ways to make money, that I should actually be grateful since I got to win all the time. He genuinely didn't seem to understand why I was upset. But I was upset. Every victory I thought I had earned was actually handed to me. Every time I felt proud of myself for beating Kyle at something, it was a lie. He had been manipulating our entire friendship to make money, using me as an unwitting accomplice in his scheme. I ended the friendship over it. Some people told me I was overreacting, that it was just a clever hustle, that no real harm was done. But trust was broken, and without trust, what's the point? I couldn't look at Kyle without seeing someone who viewed me as a mark rather than a friend. This story might seem smaller than some of the others I've shared tonight, but I think it illustrates an important point. Betrayal doesn't have to be dramatic to be real. Sometimes it's subtle, a pattern of small deceptions that adds up to a fundamental disrespect, and those kinds of betrayals can be just as damaging as the big, obvious ones. These stories we've explored tonight cover such a wide range of human experience. Romantic partners who led double lives, family members who kept devastating secrets, friends who betrayed trust in unexpected ways, colleagues who took advantage of their positions, strangers online who weren't who they claimed to be. The common thread through all of them is the importance of honesty. Every one of these situations was caused by someone choosing to lie rather than face an uncomfortable truth. And every one of these situations would have been better if honesty had been prioritized from the beginning. I know it's not always easy to be honest. Sometimes the truth is painful, both to tell and to hear. Sometimes we lie to protect ourselves or others, telling ourselves that the deception is justified. But as these stories show, lies have a way of coming out eventually, and when they do, the damage is almost always worse than it would have been if the truth had been told from the start. So as you go forward from tonight, I encourage you to think about the role honesty plays in your life. Are there truths you've been avoiding, lies you've been telling, to others or to yourself? What would change if you committed to radical honesty, even when it's hard? You might be surprised at how freeing it is to live without deception. Yes, the truth can be painful, but it's also the foundation for genuine connection, for relationships built on reality rather than illusion, and that's worth the discomfort of honesty. Thank you truly for spending this time with me. I hope these stories have given you something to think about, something to learn from, and maybe even something to help you navigate your own experiences with truth and deception. The world can be a confusing place, full of people who aren't who they seem to be. But it's also full of people who are exactly who they seem to be, who value honesty and integrity, who would never dream of deceiving the people they love. Those people are out there, and they're worth finding. Take care of yourselves, be good to each other, and remember that the truth, however painful, is always better than comfortable lies. Good night, everyone. Until next time.